Good afternoon, good evening. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is episode 8 of the KMG Show. What are we going to be talking about today? Well, we're going to talk about coronavirus, of course, and then greetings from Soviet Kazakhstan. That would be Canada. I'm going to provide you with a handful of Trump white pills, and there's quite a few. Despite the fact that the New York Times has decided and Twitter is obliging that the coronavirus is actually the Trump virus. I don't know, perhaps he ate some bats and live mice and came back to the United States, although I don't recall that happening. Nationalism, the fire rises. This includes recent riots in Greece and India. Who wants a cashless society? Well, the bankers do, but how about the rest of us? I'm going to talk about the ethical culture field house in New York City and how it's all falling to pieces. We're going to talk about scale, and once again, how that's a bad thing. And there's a fellow called Virgil Abloh, who apparently is the Karl Lagerfeld for millennials. Sounds exciting, right? And then serial killers. Don't you just love them? The media certainly does. And finally, at approximately 5:30, we are going to be discussing Maurice Pialat's Sous le soleil de Satan, under the sun of Satan. So the latest on the coronavirus. Let's see, Pope Francis sick a day after supporting coronavirus sufferers, and there are many pictures and videos of him covering his nose with a towel. He has come down with a slight indisposition, forcing him to cancel a planned mass in Rome just a day after he expressed his solidarity with coronavirus sufferers around the world and as the disease continues to spread across Italy. The illness has forced the 82-year-old pontiff to nix a penitential mass marking the start of Lent that he planned to celebrate at the St. John Lateran Basilica across town with Roman clergy. The Vatican has not specified the nature of the Pope's illness, but he was seen coughing and blowing his nose during Ash Wednesday Mass. During a general audience in St. Peter's Square on Ash Wednesday, the Pope expressed his support for coronavirus sufferers. I wish again to express my closeness to those who are ill with coronavirus and to healthcare workers who are caring for them. Francis has not specifically met with coronavirus sufferers, but shook hands with the faithful in the front row during the audience. He also kissed a baby during his Pope-mobile spin through St. Peter's Square and greeted visiting bishops. But the clergy members appeared to refrain from kissing his ring or embracing him as they normally would. Pope Francis is not very big on formality, so I don't know that there's been a lot of kissing his ring during his papacy. Now, for some reason, well, I know the reason, and I'll tell you the reason why the Dow Jones and the S&P 500 are so very vital, supposedly, to everyone in the world. Well, after 2008, things look bad. The old economy had been destroyed. It turns out that capitalism 2.0, wherein saving is bad, could only work with massive infusions of newly minted money, which were to be helicoptered onto banks. Now, what did that mean for most people? Well, it meant that, yes, you could have the things that you wanted, but you're not going to be able to get a job to pay for those. You'll have to borrow money, starting with borrowing money for your university fees. And so two indexes or indices in particular were heralded as the important data, and that would be the GDP and the stock market. Most people have little interest in the stock market, and in fact, it's actually computer bots that do most of the trading. But I suppose this is something of an own goal for Donald Trump, because he has very much tied the success of his administration to the health of the stock markets, despite the fact that they have been grossly overvalued for years. Let's see, from CNBC, Dow plunges 1,100 points, bringing its decline from record high to more than 10%. Stocks fell sharply in volatile trading Thursday as investors worried the coronavirus may be spreading in the U.S. A slew of corporate and analyst warnings on the virus dragged down the major averages, tipping them into correction territory. The Dow had its worst day since February 2018, while the NASDAQ and S&P 500 posted its biggest one-day loss since August 2011. We're extremely cautious in the short term, said Tom Hainland, global investment strategist at Ascent Private Capital Management. No one really seems to be an expert on the coronavirus. We haven't seen anything like this really in our investing lifetimes. Yes, that's why they call them black swans. Japan to close schools nationwide to control spread of coronavirus. This is from AP. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said he asked all elementary, middle, and high schools to remain closed until spring holidays begin in late March. The measure comes amid growing concern about the rise in the number of untraceable cases in northern Japan and elsewhere. Japan now has more than 890 cases, including 705 from a quarantined cruise ship. Officials in Japan's northernmost main island of Hokkaido said earlier Thursday they were closing all 1,600 elementary and middle schools in the island prefecture, with the governor saying the coming 1 to 2 weeks are crucial for fighting the virus. Now, Trump has announced a team to, Mike Pence, Vice President, is the czar. The Secretary of Health and Human Services, Azar, is there. And it now includes Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, White House Economic Advisor Larry Kudlow, and Surgeon General Jerome Adams, the former Indiana State Health Commissioner, to the Coronavirus Task Force. There's a very curious story in this regard from uns.com, from Whitney Webb. Is Wall Street behind the delay in declaring the coronavirus outbreak a pandemic? A little-known specialized bond created in 2017 by the World Bank may hold the answer as to why U.S. and global health authorities have declined to label the global spread of the novel coronavirus a pandemic. Those bonds, now often referred to as pandemic bonds, or ostensibly intended to transfer the risk of potential pandemics in low-income nations to financial markets. Yet in light of the growing coronavirus outbreak, the investors who purchased those products could lose millions if global health authorities were to use that label in relation to the surge in global coronavirus cases. On Tuesday, federal health officials at the CDC announced that they are preparing for a potential pandemic of coronavirus that first appeared in China late last year. The World Health Organization has stated that an estimated 80,000 worldwide have contracted the disease, most of them in China, while more than 2,700 have died. However, some have argued that the CDC's concerns about a likely pandemic have come too late and that action should have been taken much earlier. For instance, in early February, Dr. Anthony Fauci, director of the U.S. National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, told the New York Times that coronavirus is very, very transmissible and is almost certainly going to be a pandemic. Despite those warnings, among many others, the CDC waited to announce its concerns that the virus could spread throughout the U.S. Their Tuesday announcement riled markets, wiping out $1.7 trillion in stock market value in just 2 days. The CDC's warning has reportedly angered President Trump, who accused the agency of needlessly spooking financial markets. WHO officials have taken an even more cautious approach than the CDC in their recent comments, saying it is still too early to declare the coronavirus outbreak a pandemic. To label the outbreak a pandemic, the refusal to label it as a pandemic is odd, since this term refers to an epidemic or actively spreading disease that affects two or more regions worldwide. This currently describes the geographical spread of the highly contagious novel coronavirus, which has now resulted in significant clusters of cases far from China, namely in Italy and Iran. It's possible that concerns over using the word pandemic could upset global markets and lead to economic turmoil. So here's the background. In June 2017, the World Bank announced the creation of specialized bonds that would be used to fund the previously created Pandemic Emergency Financing Facility in the event of a WHO-recognized pandemic. They were essentially sold under the premise that those who invested in the bonds would lose their money if any of the 6 deadly pandemics hit, including coronavirus. Yet if a pandemic did not occur before the bonds mature on July the 15th, 2020, investors would receive what they had originally paid for the bonds back, in addition to interest and premium payments. So, yes, the world, the financial community bets on everything now, and of course, largely on the assumption that there's a whole host of things, well, that could never happen, or that the likelihood of these things happening is so remote that why not make a few bucks setting up bets? Now, of course, this is exactly the sort of thing that led to the economic collapse of 2007, 2008, where essentially everything, especially rubbish mortgages, were sold, resold, resold, and resold, and companies like Goldman Sachs dumped worthless investments on some of their best customers and boasted about it. Of course, no one from Goldman Sachs went to prison. So it turns out that this is not universally admired, this decision to issue pandemic bonds. Even establishment economists like former World Bank chief economist and Secretary of the Treasury, Lawrence Summers, have criticized the World Bank's program, dismissing the PEF as financial goofiness. Now, when Larry Summers speaks out about a globalist financial instrument, you know things are suspicious. Bodo Elmers, the director of Global Policy Forum's Sustainable Development Finance Program, has similarly called pandemic bonds useless, while Olga Jones, who worked at the World Bank as an economist for over 30 years, said the program was designed to fail because the bonds were crafted in order to reduce the probability of payout. Economic and business analyst and host of the podcast, Quote the Raven, Chris Irons, told Mint Press News that with respect to the pandemic bonds, quote, what's important is to focus on who stands to benefit from this not being declared a pandemic, unquote. A difficult task, given that the identity of most bondholders are not currently publicly available. So here we face the rather extraordinary position that health policy around the world is going to be affected, perhaps profoundly, because as always, people on Wall Street and in the city in London and Bay Street in Canada and all the other financial centers, they've made a stupid bet that they don't want to pay out on. If one looks into the whole question of what are called derivatives and the potential liabilities from them, one would have to conclude, or at least I would have to conclude, that only madmen or charlatans would have devised such an incredible system. Okay, let's see what's going on the chat. Alex DeLarge says, Trump took credit for the market. He insisted on it, KMG, and he owns it. Well, I'm not going to disagree. I have been warning about this for months. And I mentioned, I suppose the first example of this happening in Western politics was when Harold Macmillan was Prime Minister of Britain, and he campaigned in, 1958 or 1959, on the slogan, "You've never had it so good," which a lot of people at the time found shocking, because here he was taking personal credit for the economy. As Ludwig von Mises said, the economy is the sum of human action, and one man cannot be personally responsible. Of course, the sting in the tail here is if one takes the credit, one must accept the blame. Let's see, Alexei Luther says, can you review Rainer Werner Fassbinder or Hans-Jürgen Zeiderberg movies? Yeah, I think I may be hitting Fassbinder soon. His trilogy about Germany's economic recovery. Okay, liquidity is the only quiver central bankers have in their arrow, a chocolate fireguard in this scenario, says Phlegmaticus. Yes, it's all about liquidity now. Of course, based on the assumption that this money is never going to be paid back. Someone was saying, I just quoted someone saying, he's not a coronavirus expert. Well, I don't think there are any experts. Alex Delar says, Kevin, a derivative is simply a contract with a price that is derived, hence the term derivative from underlying security. Gold futures are derivatives. Yes, I understand that. But the difficulty is that firms like Goldman Sachs and others have maneuvered themselves into a position where it doesn't take very much bad news for essentially their entire worth to be wiped out, which is, I don't really think that was a good thing to do. And frankly, after what happened in 2007, 2008, I would have thought that, we'd heard the last of the people who had come up with this rather incredible economic system under which we live. But as Adam Curtis has explained, apparently there is no alternative. That Summers and others, that they were part of the committee to save the world, as Time magazine exulted when it put them on its cover. And what we're going to get is more of the same, I suppose, until something happens. Now, a couple of days ago, I mentioned the strange case of Canadian Senator Lynn Beyak. She had posted on her website letters that she had received from constituents on the Indigenous question, and some of these letters were held to be racist. The Senate, these are Canadians, or a selected group of Canadians, are appointed to the Senate. They're not elected. They sit until the age of 75 when they're forced to retire, and all bills must be approved by the Senate before they become law in my country. She was ordered to remove letters from her website, and she refused. And so she was suspended from the Senate, meaning she doesn't get paid, and she was ordered to attend re-education classes. Apparently, she didn't complete her re-education classes. So here's the latest on this. The Senate has voted to suspend Senator Lynn Beyak a second time over derogatory letters about Indigenous peoples posted on her website. Senators have approved a report from the Upper House's Ethics Committee, which recommended she be suspended without pay for the duration of the current parliamentary session. She's an Ontario senator appointed in 2013. She was kicked out of the Conservative caucus and eventually suspended without pay last May after refusing to remove the letters. The suspension ended automatically when Parliament dissolved for last fall's federal election. She apologized on Tuesday, after which some of her former Conservative colleagues tried unsuccessfully to refer the matter back to the Ethics Committee. However, independent, in other words, Liberal senators, took the position that Beyak needed to be suspended again while undergoing anti-racism training, and that the matter could be revisited after that. The Senate's Ethics Committee recommended last month that Beyak be suspended again because she had not met the conditions laid down by the Senate for returning to the upper house in good standing, including offering a full apology, removing letters, and taking an anti-racism training course. The Senate administration removed the letters from Beyak's website after she refused to do so herself. The Ethics Committee deemed her apology to be perfunctory and her cultural sensitivity training a fiasco. This is the world in which we live in, or at least the country in which I live in which someone is universally berated because their cultural sensitivity training was a fiasco. The training was provided by the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centres, which cut it short after concluding Beyak had no interest in confronting her ill-informed opinions about Indigenous people. Keep in mind, this is not an opinion piece. This is a news story. So, yes, she had no interest in confronting her ill-informed opinions. That is to say, apparently, she did not wish to take part in a struggle session, as the Maoists called it. So we've introduced struggle sessions, official struggle sessions to Canada. And of course, the Canadian press and all Canada's great and good, including the cowardly people who run the so-called Conservative Party of Canada, think that this is a good thing. As for what's going on with the blockades, well, there's still a bunch of blockades all over the place, new blockades being formed all the time. There's supposed to be meetings coming up. You know, the internet has changed news so radically that it's been 3 weeks now, and I suppose there's a tendency for the public, or at very least those who provide news media content, to become bored with stories unless there's some sort of spectacular development. But I can say this, that clearly the media and the Liberal Party have been shocked by the backlash against the protesters. This is clearly not popular. And the response from the media has been to talk about white supremacy and vigilantes and neo-Nazis. Oh, and by the way, Canada is an illegal country. It's always been an illegal country. So don't you dare talk about law and order. It's quite a pretty pass we've come to. Oh, here is some better news on the immigration front. That it's dawning on a lot of people, particularly amongst the progressives, that for all of their talk about stymieing Donald Trump, which of course has been echoed by the black pillars and all the Whig-nats, that Trump is having a great deal of success on that front. As mentioned earlier, Justice Sonia Sotomayor handed down a ferocious dissent last Friday after the Supreme Court lifted the final barrier to a Trump administration rule that withholds green cards from immigrants dependent on government services. This is the so-called public charge rule, which was mandatory and uncontroversial for many decades until our betters decided that, oh yeah, immigrants, they're the future of our economy. How can they be the future of our economy when so many of them are on public assistance? Don't talk about that. That would be racist. Talk about inhumanity. Talk about how, cruel, terribly cruel the Trump administration is. Well, I suppose if one is going to enforce the law, a certain amount of cruelty, if you will, is involved. Also a certain amount of arbitrariness. Let's see, appeals court rules Trump administration can block grants to sanctuary cities. The Trump administration can withhold grant money from New York City and several states that don't give U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement access to jails, an appeals court ruled Wednesday. The decision, a serious blow to sanctuary cities, reversed a previous ruling that prevented the federal government from withholding grants from the Big Apple and 7 states New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Washington, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Virginia. The U.S. Justice Department in a statement praised the decision, calling it a major victory for Americans. Today's decision rightfully recognizes the lawful authority of the U.S. Attorney General to ensure that Department of Justice grant recipients are not at the same time thwarting federal law enforcement priorities. Well, you know, it's a curious, I mentioned before that it was Richard Nixon who decided in the late 1960s that the federal government had so much money that it was going to start doling out large amounts of this money to cities. And that's one of those decisions which seemed good at the time and later in retrospect came to be seen as rather a nightmare because, oh, well, the government always has to, federal government always has to give cities large amounts of money. Well, what if the federal government doesn't have the money? That doesn't matter. I'm looking at a map of sanctuary cities, states, and counties. As one might expect, Washington and Oregon, the whole place seems to be sanctuary. Northern California and Southern California again. Colorado, clearly one of the leaders. Also, curiously, Iowa. And along the East Coast, particularly in the New England area, but also in South Carolina. Why aren't these people arrested? Seriously, that they're engaged in a conspiracy to prevent federal law from being enforced. The Trump administration is turning to federal courts to force state and local officials to turn over records about immigrants in custody in a novel effort to circumvent so-called sanctuary policy, Reuters reports. Since mid-January, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement officials, ICE, has issued subpoenas to law enforcement agencies in California, Colorado, Connecticut, New York, and Oregon, seeking information about nearly 24 suspected immigration law violators. The inmates had been charged or convicted of crimes that include sexual abuse of a child, manslaughter, and burglary, according to ICE. The legal actions could help ICE obtain a wide range of information on immigrants in jail, including last known address, possible gang affiliations, and any disciplinary actions while in custody. In some cases, the agency requested photos of the immigrants as well. The details could be used by immigration authorities to track down people if they are let out and process them for deportation. I just see this as a winnable, to put it mildly, election issue. These people refuse to allow the deportation of criminals, not just people who broke the law by entering the United States illegally, but then committed crimes, often very serious crimes, including rape and murder, which wouldn't have been committed if they had been deported. These people have blood on their hands. There is no other way to describe it. There's an amusing story for the Cincinnati Enquirer, and it's a month old, but I just came across it. An arrest inside a Cincinnati courthouse last week prompted a political fight over whether federal immigration police should be allowed to arrest undocumented immigrants who show up for court appearances. Now, a common police judge in Hamilton County has said that when he suspects a defendant is undocumented, he calls ICE himself. Robert Ruhlman, who's clearly a great man, told the Enquirer, "They're committing a crime by being here illegally, and then if they're in front of me, they've allegedly committed a felony." How does he know someone is here illegally? If the person needs an interpreter, is accused of drug smuggling, or has international connections. Ruhlman said he acts on his hunch. "I set a high bond and I call ICE. I'm batting 1,000. I haven't got one wrong yet." Ruhlman said he calls ICE about a dozen times a year and says he has a good relationship with that agency. What have we heard recently? That Greyhound, the bus company, is not going to allow ICE agents onto its buses to find people who are in the United States illegally. And several leading banks, including Wells Fargo, JP Morgan, HSBC, have said that they will not do banking business with ICE contractors. How are these companies still allowed to be in business? Again, this is a criminal conspiracy we're talking about here. This isn't a political disagreement. It's a criminal conspiracy. From the Los Angeles Times, Trump has flipped the Ninth Circuit, and some new judges are calling a shock wave. How about that? And all credit must be given to Cocaine Mitch McConnell, because as soon as a vacancy comes up, well, there's a list from the Federalist Society, and they get these judges, and it is making a big difference, and it is going to make an even bigger difference in the future. When Trump ticks off his accomplishments since taking office, he frequently mentions his aggressive makeover of a key sector of the federal judiciary, the Circuit Courts of Appeal, where he's appointed 51 judges to lifetime jobs in 3 years. In few places has the effect been more powerfully felt than in the sprawling Ninth Circuit, which covers California and 8 other states. Because of Trump's success in filling vacancies, the San Francisco-based circuit, long dominated by Democratic appointees, has suddenly shifted to the right, with an even more pronounced tilt expected in years ahead. So the Times interviewed judges, and the old guard seems to be shell-shocked. Among those who have caused the most consternation is Judge Daniel Collins, a former federal prosecutor and partner of a prestigious law firm. Some judges said in the early months of his tenure, Collins has appeared oblivious to court tradition. He has sent memos at all times of the night in violation of a court rule and objected to other judges' rulings in language that some colleagues found combative. Oh, dear. Collins also moved quickly to challenge rulings by his new colleagues, calling for review of 5 decisions by 3-judge panels, and some of the calls came before Collins had even been assigned to his first panel. Oh, I thought we were all in favor of activist judges because, it's a living constitution and all that. I suppose, it depends on who's in charge. This from Fox News. The State Department is stepping up an advertising campaign in Central America to warn would-be migrants against traveling illegally to the United States. The message that we're sending is that the pathway to the U.S. illegally is a futile journey, said a senior State Department official. The U.S. government is funding several billboards in Guatemala and El Salvador, as well as advertising panels on bus stops in Honduras that are going up this week. The billboards caution Central Americans that the road to the USA has become more dangerous. Don't put your children at risk. Give them the security they deserve. This is part of a broader campaign that involves radio ads and social media posts from U.S. embassy staffers in the region. The federal government has previously used advertising campaigns like this to dissuade Central Americans from illegally traveling to the U.S., though thousands every month make the trip anyway, fleeing violence, corruption, and poverty. Yeah, that doesn't cut it for asylum. Sorry, corruption, poverty, and violence, which is not state violence, this does not make you eligible for, what used to be called political asylum. You don't hear that term political anymore because these are economic migrants. There's no question about it. They're not political migrants. Now, okay, what else we got here? Watchdog sues government for info about controversial Trump advisor. A government ethics watchdog filed a lawsuit against several federal agencies Wednesday to obtain information about the involvement of White House advisor Stephen Miller in the Trump administration's public charge immigration rule. American Oversight said the suit seeks information from communications, including emails, between Miller and the Departments of Labor, Housing and Agriculture and the Centers for Medicare and Medicare Studies. The watchdog said Miller is the architect of the public charge rule, which allows the government to restrict immigration based on how likely it is any given migrant would apply for food stamps, Medicaid, and other domestic services while living in the U.S. American Oversight and other critics of the rule say it amounts to a wealth test. Well, so what if it does. Miller has been an outspoken critic of unlawful immigration, and in the past has been accused, I guess by Katie McHugh, the doxer-in-chief, of having a white supremacist ideology. He is widely believed to have led President Donald Trump's tougher immigration policy. Yeah, and Coulter and some others would have you believe that Stephen Miller, he is not our guy. Stephen Miller is only interested in personal publicity, getting all the credit, and he's constantly intervening to keep American patriots out of the Trump White House. So who is this organization? Two members of the Democracy Alliance contributed seed money in 2017 to a new organization created to file hundreds of Freedom of Information Act requests in hopes of unearthing scandal on the Trump administration. IRS 990 forms show that money is just shy of 10% of the $3.44 million assembled for the first-year launch of American Oversight, which currently claims to have lodged more than 100 FOIA lawsuits. Corruption starts at the top, the group's website states on its About page. From President Trump's failure to divest from his business empire to cabinet secretaries using their taxpayer-funded positions for their personal benefit, the Trump administration has been plagued by scandal, misconduct, and conflict of interests. Now, who Stephen Miller communicated with, the reasons that he came up for the advice that he gives the President of the United States, is none of their business. How could it possibly be their business? I had never heard of this group before, but that's a frequent experience for me. That apparently there's an organization, an NGO, which is enormously influential and has enormous amounts of money from various sources. This is one of the great plagues of our ages. The number of rent seekers and how powerful and well remunerated these rent seekers are. That's the rent seekers, and they're attempting to thwart the will of the electorate through a process called Lawfare. Let's talk a little bit more about Lawfare. This is from Moment magazine. This is a piece from last month. Roberta Kaplan takes white supremacy to court. The New York lawyer has a new legal strategy to fight 21st century extremism. If she wins, it could be groundbreaking, reports Ellen Wexler. Okay, back to Charlottesville, and Jews will not replace us. That's what they were chanting. No, that's not what they were chanting. They were chanting, you will not replace us, but never mind. Kaplan, best known as the lawyer who helped legalize gay marriage in the U.S., had just started her own law firm in New York City. Oh, and on television, President Donald Trump insisted on an equivalency that there were very fine people on both sides. One of the paralegals ran out of the room in tears. This is a lie. This is a deliberate lie. This magazine, the media has just decided to double down, triple down, quadruple down on this. That Trump said that there were good people, very fine people on both sides, and what he was referring to was those people who had gone to Charlottesville to protest against the removal of Confederate memorials. Kaplan's first thought, something needed to be done, regardless of whether the Department of Justice stepped in. Could civil litigation, she wondered, work against the Unite the Right? The Unite the Right just doesn't exist anymore in any meaningful way. She called her friend Dahlia Lithwick, a legal writer for Slate. Oh, how very convenient. Lithwick offered to make introductions should Kaplan decide to visit. With a legal strategy taking shape in her mind, she met with victims. Victims? What victims are we talking about? Except for that woman, Heather Heyer, who died. Where are all these other victims? There was all this thrashing about from both sides, but the narrative, of course, is that these Antifa people are by their nature, they're pacifists. You know, they would never strike out in anger against people. But see, the point of this story, of this narrative, is that these are the underdogs. Rebecca Kaplan is an underdog. She cautioned them that suing Unite the Right would require sacrifice. They would risk, among other things, becoming targets. Once again, nearly a dozen would sign on, and some, like University of Virginia student Natalie Romero, had already been targeted more than once that weekend. Yeah, okay. So let's, yes, using an obscure federal law, the KKK Act of 1871, it argues that the rally's organizers conspired to commit violence. Oh, yes, and Discord chats. Okay. Does anyone still use Discord? And if so, why? The defendants are 24 neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and extremist groups connected to the Charlottesville March. There's Jason Kessler, James Fields Jr., Richard Spencer, Christopher Cantwell, and Andrew Anglin. And there follows a picture of the KKK in their robes and their hoods, burning a cross, as if this has something to do with what happened in Charlottesville. Let's see, Kaplan is not fazed by the notoriety of the defendants. What does that even mean? So she dismantled parts of the Defense of Marriage Act. More recently, in the wake of the Me Too movement, she founded the Time's Up Legal Defense Committee. There's a trial occurring in October. Essentially, what Rebecca Kaplan and people, her ilk, are doing, are saying is that if you're engaged in political activity that we disagree with, we are going to destroy you. For some reason, it says here, unlike other moments of Jewish history, we live in a country with a constitution and a system of rules and law. Yeah, just throw that in there for some particular reason. We need the cooperation of partner groups like the Anti-Defamation League. We need to educate people. Yes, we need to educate people so that they will believe that anyone who disagrees with me is a Nazi or a white supremacist. Well, what is a Nazi? What is a white supremacist? Come on, it's people we don't like. As we've learned, if you argue against high immigration numbers, particularly from the third world, this makes you a white protectionist, a white supremacist, a Nazi. Oh, and she goes on to explain how Judaism informs her work. We absolutely can and will bankrupt these groups, and then we will chase these people around for the rest of their lives. So if they try to buy a new home, we will put a lien on the home. If they get a new job, we will garnish their wages. The reason to do that is because we want to create a deterrence impact. So we send a message to other people that if you try to do something like this, the same thing will happen to you. And it already has been a deterrence. We're seeing lone shooters now. We're not seeing the kind of massively organized conspiracy we saw in Charlottesville. And I think that's in large part due to our case. I'm astonished. So John F. Kennedy famously said, or it was ascribed to him, that those who make peaceful protest impossible make violent uprising inevitable. This woman, Rebecca Kaplan, is boasting that is precisely what has happened, that the message has been sent out, that if you belong to a dissident political group, we will destroy you, so don't even bother. And that, of course, leads to a bunch of people getting guns and killing people. But apparently that is progress. I mean, I just find this, astonishing, but perhaps I shouldn't. Maybe just, these people are, they want to ruin us, as Sam Hyde said, and they think that it's funny. They think that, there's nothing that can be done to stop them. Well, they may be in for a rude surprise. Lawfare is based on the assumption, or it's partially based on the assumption that these people, the friends of Rebecca and the Friends of Dahlia, they own the courts. Well, as I just described a few minutes ago, increasingly they don't own the courts any longer. Let's call it Trump virus, says Gail Collins, opinion columnist for the New York Times. So the coronavirus czar is going to be Mike Pence feeling more secure? I know full well the importance of presidential leadership, the VP said. Totally qualified. First criteria for every job in this administration is capacity for praising the gloriousness of your commander-in-chief. And of course, that has never happened in previous administrations. It certainly, there was no obsequiousness towards Barack Obama back, between 2009 and 2017. No. No one was, groveling before him. No one was treating him as some sort of black messiah or anything like that. This is someone commented, Vox Day said that they always project. SJWs always project. And yeah, apparently coronavirus is Donald Trump's responsibility. Now, a similar thing happened in the 1980s, that it was Margaret Heckler, the Secretary of HHS, who defined AIDS as the result of HIV infection. There was no scientific consensus on this. She just laid down the law at a press conference. That's not how it's supposed to work. Now, the Reagan administration immediately started spending large amounts of money on AIDS treatment. But the narrative was sent out there that Ronald Reagan was personally responsible for everyone who got sick and everyone who died because of AIDS. This had nothing to do with their personal behavior. No, it was Ronald Reagan's fault. So they're going to try and make the coronavirus Donald Trump's fault. I don't think that is going to work, but it's not going to stop them from trying. Now, Trump has, here's another lesson from Vox Day. Of course, he's not the only person to have said this, but with regard to Senator Lynn Beyak, never apologize, especially to those people. Never. Because they will demand further apologies. They will demand, ritual actions. Perhaps, we'll get soon to the point where these people will bloody themselves with sharp stones in public, while we guffaw at them for holding the wrong opinions. You know that Trump is being successful when the New York Times starts moaning about how terrible he is, particularly his actions. Again, there's this strange cognitive dissonance among the progressives. Trump's an idiot. He's an orange-haired buffoon. He's a failure at everything. On the other hand, he's the most dangerous man in the history of the United States. Both those things can't be true. Here we have Nicholas Kristof. Trump uses kids sold into sex slavery to score political points. Using human trafficking for pernicious political purposes is a Trump administration invention. You see, they're really hurt by this because the Trump administration, perhaps under the guidance of Stephen Miller, has decided to push the human trafficking angle because that's what's going on at the U.S. border. We know from their side that something up to 40% of the women, that's their claim, up to 40% of the women involved in these caravans across Central America to the U.S. border had been sexually molested during the journey. Now, the obvious solution to this is to stop coming. If you don't want to be separated from your children, don't drag your children across the U.S. border. But no. These people don't care about these children. They don't care about the people who are being abused. They simply want the United States and all the Western countries to be overrun overrun by people who will work for very little money, will put up with all sorts of ill behavior, and will vote for the Democratic Party in the United States and other left-leaning parties in other countries. Their lack of sincerity, I could say that it's breathtaking, but I don't know, we're all used to this now, aren't we? Let's see, what's going on in the chat? Oh, people are looking at my numbers. Let's see, I belong to a group in New York City during the AIDS era. We cured people by keeping them off drugs and doing proper diet, says Dawn from Beyond. But, there was talk about quarantines at the beginning of AIDS and, shutting down bathhouses or whatever. But I guess that would have been homophobic, not that I believe that there was much use of that word. That, the important thing we learned from the AIDS epidemic is not hurting people's feelings. Lone shooter at Coors Plant was an African-American, white supremacist, says STFU James M. This is Steve Saylor has pointed out that this story is going to be memory hold, but not before we hear the claims that everyone in this plant was racist and a certain word was used, and so that justifies mass murder. Alex Large says, yes, Discord is still quite popular. Again, I cannot imagine why. KMG, the alcoholic gambler, has his own show. Gambler? How am I a gambler? Yeah. You take the mark or you will be harassed or worse for the rest of your life. Still, it's far better to keep your soul. It is, but clearly the gathering at Charlottesville was a logistical disaster from the very beginning. And I don't know how useful any these sorts of gatherings are. I mean, look, we've seen the results on the ground. That whenever a group of dissident, whatever you call them, people get together, Antifa shows up. And Antifa lets it be known that they're going to, bash people's skulls. They're going to try them, run them off the street. And any attempt to fight back will be seen as a crime, and the police forces play along. The police forces are quite happy to let Antifa take over the role of the police. I mean, Antifa is pretty much to seize control of the city of Portland, to give one reason. The Myth of Heterosexual AIDS by Michael Fumento is mentioned. I've mentioned this book before. It became a bestseller. Everything that Fumento said in that book was true, and yet he became public enemy number one. Because AIDS was everyone's problem, everyone's disease. And of course, it wasn't. Very simple. If you abstain from homosexual sex, if you do not use IV drugs, then your chances of getting AIDS are minuscule. As I mentioned previously, a study, an in-depth survey study done by the city of New York, in which they could not confirm a single case of a woman engaging solely in heterosexual sex ever coming down with AIDS. Surely you think Southerners have a right to defend monuments, correct? Not saying Charlottesville was brilliant, but it was inevitable. I don't know that it was inevitable, well, for reasons I mentioned before, but I'll repeat now, that when your boast is, your taunt is that you are wading into the belly of the beast, you had best be prepared. And these people were not prepared in the slightest. Ricky Bullock says, KMG, I emailed your Shaw account about upgrading your audio equipment. I appreciate that, and I appreciate all such technical suggestions, which I'm going to be working on over this weekend. As I mentioned yesterday, it's been a shock for me to go from being a guest on a show to carrying a show for 2 hours, and I think I'm getting a little better at it. I hope to get much better, in fact. But baby steps for now. So, nationalism, supposedly dead, right? That, that was the way of the past. That the way of the future was transnational government, the surrender of sovereignty, because political sovereignty, leads to destruction, mass destruction. So goes the narrative. But nationalism has made a big, big return. There's the Trump election. Keep in mind, he ran on the slogan, "Make America Great Again" and "America First." We have the Brexit vote. We have governments in Hungary and Poland that are saying, no, we are not going to be the slaves of the European Union. And here's a story from Agence France-Presse. Hundreds of protesters on the Greek island of Lesbos on Wednesday threw stones at police who responded with tear gas, stun grenades, and rubber bullets on a second day of demonstrations against the construction of new migrant camps. "You're going to die here," one protester shouted at police as others screamed obscenities at them. 10 protesters and dozens of police officers were lightly injured in the day-long clashes in Mantamados, a village near a construction site for a camp to house 7,000 migrants. "We're in a wartime situation," local priest Father Stratus told AFP. "The police have the weapons, we have our heart and soul." In other words, we are not going to have our country stolen from us. A general strike was observed on Lesbos, Chios, and Samos, the islands with the largest migrant populations, as Prime Minister Mitsotakis called for calm amid mounting criticism from the opposition. 2,000 people demonstrated on Chios, where a group later broke into a hotel where riot police were staying, injuring 8 of them. After weeks of fruitless talks with island officials on where to build the new facilities, the government on Monday secretly shipped construction machinery and hundreds of riot police to Lesbos and Chios, causing outrage. Opposition parties say the move is undemocratic, and regional officials called it a barbaric attempt to forcefully turn Lesbos and Chios into prison. This is not the way to gain the confidence of the people, is to make secret decisions that, we're going to dump 7,000 migrants on your little island. Construction of the new facilities has already begun, the Prime Minister said, adding that the new camps are very far from urban areas. Oh, they'll just despoil the countryside then. And can they be kept out of urban areas? That's certainly not been Italy's experience. It's certainly not been the experience of Germany. More than 38,000 migrants, most of whom arrived from nearby Turkey, are crowded into camps on a handful of islands despite an official capacity of just 6,200. The islanders on the forefront of the migration crisis for the past 5 years have long complained that the presence of thousands of asylum seekers threatens safety and public health. Yeah, especially with diseases like coronavirus. We are also fighting for those who want to go to a better place. We want them to leave the squalid camps, Father Stratus said. We will embrace war refugees, but the criminals should go back. Well, there's the problem. That when you're dealing with failed states, and of course Syria is a failed state, you don't know anything about anybody. If you look at the 9/11 attackers, they supposedly came from Saudi Arabia. They had Saudi Arabian documents. Were they really Saudis? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. Obviously, it's much easier to get into the United States from Saudi Arabia than it is from a place like Jordan, and so people will obtain documents. We are creating 20,000 places of hospitality on the islands. Wow. That is a pretty neat euphemism for invasion. 20,000 places of hospitality. I would be irresponsible, said the migration minister, if I allowed the islands to remain undefended in the face of migration flows. We asked residents to trust us. Why? There is a limit to our patience, said one villager, Stratos Paspalas, a retired butcher. They requisition areas and bring riot police, tear gas people. Are we at war? Yeah, you are at war. You are at war. Your country is being invaded, and your leaders are traitors. I know that's a strong word, but what other word could possibly be appropriate? So here's another story from the New York Times. The roots of the Delhi riots, a fiery speech and an ultimatum. A local Hindu politician told the police to evict a group of Muslim protesters or he and his men would. Now, 25 have died in some of the worst violence in years. Millions died when India was partitioned in 1947. There are hundreds of millions of Muslims in India, and the Muslims and the Hindus have been slaughtering each other in considerable numbers for decades. But this latest incident began with one man, according to the Times story. Kapil Mishra, a local politician with India's leading Hindu nationalist party, had just lost an election. Acquaintances in the area, which now feels like a war zone, said he'd been looking for a way to bounce back. He's 39 years old. He's an upper caste Hindu from a political family. He had worked for Amnesty International and Greenpeace and risen in the ranks of one of India's most progressive political organizations. Now, you know that things are changing. When someone associated with Amnesty International and Greenpeace becomes one of your country's leading nationalists. On Sunday, he appeared at a rally against a group of protesters, most women, who were objecting to a new citizenship law widely seen as discriminatory toward Muslims. There he vented his anger in a fiery speech in which he issued an ultimatum to the police, either clear out the demonstrators who were blocking a main road, or he and his followers would do it themselves. Within hours, the worst Hindu-Muslim violence in India in years was exploding. Gangs of Hindus and Muslims fought each other with swords and bats. Shops burst into flames, chunks of brick sailed through the air, and mobs rained blows on cornered men. Many Indians, including Hindus, believe that Mishra and his Hindu nationalists have weaponized a very dangerous mood. In a Hindu-majority nation with a Hindu nationalist government that has allowed the killers of Muslims to go unpunished, fear has been growing that violent Hindu extremism could spin out of control. So are Hindus going to be added to the list of supremacist villains now? Because I guess in any dispute, well, I've described this before. The way the media sees it, in any dispute between Muslims and someone else, the Muslims are right, and the Muslims must be supported. This is a very serious situation, obviously, for India because of the vast numbers of Muslims. But for one thing, the government of India has decided that it is not going to permit any more Muslim immigration to its country, particularly from Bangladesh. And this is one of the things that's led to the recent troubles. I want to move on to a financial issue here. One of Britain's best columnists is a man called Stephen Glover. He was one of the co-founders of the Independent newspaper, which at the beginning was nowhere near as left-wing as it has become. This is about the cashless society. Now, apparently it's moving fast in Britain. I read that Sweden intends to ban cash within a few years. Sweden is the kind of country where that sort of decision is made by the elite all the time, and the reaction to the Swedish people is, well, yes, I suppose we'll have to do that. I mean, Sweden is a country where if they ordered everyone, as the joke goes, to wear green on Thursday, they would all wear green on Thursday, because one does not want to be seen as anti-Swedish. Stephen Glover writes, estimates vary, but it's widely predicted that Britain is well on the way to becoming a cashless society and could reach that state within 10 to 15 years. Has the public been consulted? No. Is the government showing signs of concern about the millions of people who would struggle to cope with a cashless society? Not that I've noticed. Most of us will have experienced how increasingly difficult it is even to get access to one's own money. First of all came the bank closures. A staggering 3,300 branches in the UK put up their shutters between January 2015 and August 2019, equivalent to 34% of all the banks in the country. Last week, Money Mail carried a harrowing story of the disastrous effect of closures on local businesses in St. Ives in Cornwall. The seaside town has lost 7 banks since 2015, and the sole surviving one may be up for the chop. And as that process continues apace nationwide, the banks are decreasing their financial support for the network that administers cash machines. Between January 2018 and December 2019, the number of free-to-use machines fell from 5,500 to 4,500. Now, it seemed to me there was a compact there, that the banks decided that they could save a lot of money by closing bricks and mortar branches. But what they gave in return was a system of ATM machines that would be free to use for everyone, and that system, it no longer exists anymore. If you do not use an ATM machine, which is part of your system or affiliated with your system, you will have to pay to get your own money. Glover writes, more and more ATMs charge up to £2 per transaction. As a result, fees paid by the public to withdraw their own cash have risen from £29 million to £104 million a year. In my bailiwick of Oxford, hardly the back of beyond, the 4 cash machines closest to my house have all closed in recent years, so that a car or bus journey is now obligatory in search of banknotes. According to the consumer group, which the remaining network of free cash machines faces collapse within 2 years unless the government forces banks to maintain the system. Isn't it clear that, whether we like it or not, the banks are deliberately pushing us towards a cashless society by making it so hard for us to use cash? What's in it for them are greater profits. They want us to use bank cards or smartphone apps such as Apple Pay whenever possible, because it saves them the expense and time of counting and handling cash and the cost of transporting the stuff. Banks and companies such as Visa and MasterCard also make billions worldwide in fees, typically paid by the retailer for processing electronic payments. The big retailers also prefer cards to cash. Whenever we use a piece of plastic, there is a record of our purchase. The data can be used by the shop or sold on, so that other retailers can target us with advertising for similar products. I've explained in detail, exhausting or enervating detail, how I was pretty much forced to surrender all my financial privacy in order to have a PayPal account. That PayPal knows where I spend my money, at what time, on what, how much I spend, etc., etc. But of course, it would never, sell on that money to other organizations. I mean, I can't. Anytime I go to Amazon to look stuff up, or if I've looked stuff up on Amazon, and if I used a Google search, then suddenly this would be at the top. That everything that I do is being tracked. Whatever fleeting interest I might have in a book or a CD or whatever, it is instantly known, and there is an attempt to exploit that knowledge. Now, I've switched from Google to DuckDuckGo, so I'm getting less of that now. As recently as 2017, Glover wrote, research by retail analyst Mintel suggested that only 33% of adults are in favor of a cashless society. Among those over 55, that figure fell to 20%. What's wrong with cash? Whenever you spend it, you are not being tracked by Big Brother. There's a marvelous sense of freedom and security simply in having it. You're not a statistic on someone else's screen. It's yours. You can put a coin in a beggar's hat, or give £5 on a whim to a favorite grandchild, or drop a note into the church collection, although some parishes are almost unbelievably introducing card readers. A report last year by a body called Access to Cash Review speculated that there are 8 million adults who would struggle to cope in a world without cash. That is an awful lot of people. I don't think I'm particularly technophobic, but I'm driven half mad when I find myself, say in central London, required to pay a parking charge on the street via a smartphone rather than with old-fashioned coins. Why should it be assumed that everyone has a mobile phone? What happens if one is left at home? The business of texting or telephoning is about 10 times more drawn out than inserting coins, but of course it suits the counsel in question. This is what Kingsley Amis described as the easier for them principle. When I was living in Vancouver and I worked in downtown Vancouver, I noticed that a great many of the banks there were closing. And infuriatingly, they would put up signs saying, in order to serve you better, we are closing this branch. How is it serving me better to close my branch and force me to go, some distance further to a branch which remains open? But they don't think twice about using language which is not only false, but infuriatingly so. Glover says, I find it quite irritating enough to be made to use a card on a British Airways flight in Europe to buy food and drink, which incidentally used to be free. Conspiracy is a much overused word, but it's hard not to see a kind of orchestrated attempt by banks and shops to force us to change our established way of doing things to make life simpler and more profitable for them. With regard to mobile phone, I had not had a cell phone or a mobile, whatever you want to call it, let alone a smartphone. And I thought, why do I need one? Oh, for emergencies. Well, as George Costanza said, at any one time in the world, there are something like 2 or 3 emergencies going on. I've ever, personally been involved in an emergency that would require me to make a phone call to someone, right there, when I'm not at home. I don't think that I had. I mean, I suppose it might have been more convenient in some ways, but I was determined not to have one. Not least because I don't want to become one of these people stumbling down the street, oblivious to the traffic all around me and the nature all around me, and the people all around me, staring down at what Charlie Brooker called a handheld twit machine. But then, it was put to me rather strongly by Twitter and PayPal that I had best get a mobile phone, and which I did last summer. I have spent hundreds of dollars on this device and the monthly charges, and I would reckon that I probably made about a half dozen calls in all that time. But gotta have a mobile phone. You just got to. What are you, some sort of Luddite? What century are you living in? These things all become, essential, and they're not essential, but we make them essential. So, next up. Yeah, this is a typical story of our age. It's from the New York Post. The irony behind the decline of an elite liberal private school. Taken to extremes, liberalism eats its own. Exhibit A is the decline of one of the most prestigious and proudly liberal private schools in the city, Ethical Culture Fieldston in Riverdale, founded in 1878 by the son of a rabbi as a model for social justice, racial equality, and intellectual freedom, now is convulsed by allegations of anti-Semitism, racial discrimination lawsuits, quarrels over identity politics, a diversity, equity, and inclusion department run amok, and a unionized faculty impervious to criticism. I've heard of ethical culture, but I thought that it was one of those things, like service organizations that had disappeared decades ago, but apparently it's still around, at least in New York City. Disgruntled parents are considering ways of extracting their children. Angry donors are closing their wallets, and distraught teachers are resigning or taking leaves of absence. For some parents, concerns were crystallized when Fieldston students became aware that a YouTube video, Secrets of the Living Dolls, featured a new member of the faculty, a self-described large black man with a fetish for dressing up as a sexy white woman in a lifelike latex mask and breasts. And of course, that's exactly the sort of fellow that you would want around your children. And this is just otherwise makes you guilty of a hate crime. "I fought for alphabet people issues," said one Fieldston parent, "but this is indicative of the weird things happening around the school, which are rooted around intersectionality and an obsession about identity, politics, and race." School Insider says the video bothers a particular group of parents, but in the hierarchy of problems at the school, I don't consider this to be a particularly big one. Far more troubling is an atmosphere at the school of, quote, rampant systemic anti-Semitism, unquote. The issue came to a head this past November when Fieldston invited Qayyum Ahmed, who works for, wait for it, George Soros's Open Society Foundations, to speak at an assembly, and he likened Israel to Nazi Germany. The school erupted. Parents noticed that while the school had no problem inviting the controversial Ahmed, when a female student wanted to invite Jonathan Haidt, author of The Coddling of the American Mind, administrators threatened to boycott because he was seen as conservative. He is not, in fact, conservative. He is what you would call an old-fashioned liberal. So the head of the school says, "We will not accept anti-Semitism. We will not accept racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia. We will not accept hatred in all its ugly shapes and forms." In January, to placate angry parents, 2 rabbis were invited to speak at Fieldston, but the event was marred by a protest staged by history and sex ed teacher J.B. Brager, a self-described trans-Jewish scholar who goes by the pronoun they. Brager flipped the bird at the rabbis, according to 2 parents who viewed a video taken by a student. A few days later, Brager left the schools. One of the most contentious issues at Fieldston has been the introduction of affinity groups separating children by race. The groups, quote, "are rooted in a sociological model of whiteness that completely disregards the lived Jewish experience, and for a community with above average population of second and third and even first generation Jews, that was deeply problematic," said one insider. "There are relationships with the school that will never be repaired. It really represented a turning point in the trajectory of the school." A mother says the groups were pretext. They take kids of color and make them angry. It's a start of blame culture. White people are to blame. The poison is far-reaching. Boys and white people are demonized. If you're a straight white Jewish boy, you're the worst. So the teachers are unionized. It's a unionized faculty, and they might have their own set of values to champion, which may be at odds with the brand promise ethical culture delivers to students. Here's the funny part. The political angst at the school spilled over when Donald Trump was elected president. The school was closed for days, says one parent. The first day, teachers didn't come to class. They protested the second day, and the third day there was counseling. What kind of fragile snowflakes are we cultivating that they can't deal with a presidential election that doesn't go their way? Well, not my president, right? I mean, Donald Trump is not the lawful president of the United States, according to these people, because what, Hillary won more popular votes? Because Putin stole the election, and that Trump is a tool of the Russians? I mean, it's all nonsense, really, but these people believe it. And they had really come to the conclusion by 2016 that they were going to win every election unto infinity. And part of the reason was immigration, that the country gets browner, and these people don't vote for the evil Republicans. Well, they don't, actually, for the most part, but the difference is that a large group of people who had felt shut out of American politics decided to re-enter it, to vote for Trump, leading to a collective nervous breakdown, which has yet to recede. And, it looks more and more clear, at least to me, that Trump is going to win the 2020 election. And, Republicans may take back the House of Representatives. And what Kunstler predicts that there's going to be a move to invalidate the elections, or maybe to prevent them from happening. Because, we can't let illegal Donald Trump illegally win another election. So steps will need to be taken I certainly hope it doesn't come to that, but keep in mind what I was saying about Rebecca Adler, that these people are willing to win by any means necessary. And as Jesse Jackson famously said, it ain't over till it's over, and even then, it's not over. In other words, we win. We always win. I hope that these people are getting used to the idea that they might not win. I hope that they're getting used to the idea that the techniques and tactics that they have employed against the rest of us could be employed against them as well. Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes before we move on to Theater Thursday, so I don't think I'm going to be able to get around to all the stories I put on the sked, but that means I'll have a head start on tomorrow. Arnold Kling writes, and he's quoting F.H. Buckley, "We're overly big, one of the biggest countries in the world. Smaller countries are happier and less corrupt. They're less inclined to throw their weight around militarily, and they're freer. If there are advantages to bigness, the costs exceed the benefits. Bigness is badness." It sounds like I should read his new book, American Secession. And he lists the most populous nations in the world, of which the United States comes in at number 3 after China and India. He says, "Note that the governments of all of them, with the exception of the US and Japan, are either very authoritarian, incompetent, or both. I've made this point before in different ways, but the US is not comparable to Denmark or Singapore. The peer group for the US is the countries on the list above. And from that perspective, we really should be grateful for what we have. Scale is seriously underrated as a challenge in human society." I'm really glad to see that more and more people are coming to accept this, that small is beautiful, and that overscaled societies are inhuman, alienating, and they become sclerotic. F.H. Buckley had a piece in the New York Post last month, "How to Avoid America's Coming Secession Crisis. The craziness of our politics makes one wonder what's around the bend. After La Résistance, the pussy hats, the nonstop crises, and the permanent impeachment, what might be the next shoe to drop? The answer, a breakup of the country, as I argue in my new book, American Succession. Americans have never been more divided, and we're ripe for secession. The bitterness, the gridlock, the growing tolerance of violence invite us to think that we'd be happier were we two different countries. In all the ways that matter, save for the naked force of law, we are already two nations. And if that's where we are today, where might we be in an easily imaginable future where impeachment fizzles, as it did, and Trump wins election and gets a couple more appointments to the Supreme Court? If secession were to happen, it would be the left-wing states that want out, places like California and Oregon. But as I was discussing this week, there are large numbers of people in both California and Oregon who want out of those states and want to join a greater Idaho. If they think the rest of the country is populated by deplorables, why would they want to be in the same country as the rest of us? There's a second reason why secession beckons. We're overly big, one of the biggest countries in the world. Yes, that's a quote that I made earlier. Around the world, just about every country is staring down a secession movement. Many have already split apart. And are we to think we're immune from this? If you think secession is per se bad, what do you think of Amer exit when we seceded from the British Empire in 1776? If the possibility of secession hasn't occurred to us, it's because of the awful precedent of the Civil War and the 750,000 Americans, actually it was closer to 1 million, who died in it. Would that happen with secession 2.0? Not hardly. Modern secessions tend to be peaceful and accomplished through negotiation and some movement of people. That's the story of the Quebec secession movement. Nobody picked up a gun, and though the province didn't actually secede, French became the province's official language, and a lot of English speakers moved to Toronto, and not just Toronto as well. So, yeah, I want to move on to something that to do with the elite. This is someone called Fossetti writing with reference to Arnold Kling, who I just quoted. He recently wrote one of the most disturbing posts I can ever remember reading. You should read the whole thing once or twice. I'll excerpt some bits in case you don't. Tyler Cowen pictures an economy evolving over the next 20 years to one with a slice of high earners, the 20% or so whose skills complement the ever-expanding power of computers, and then a large group that lives comfortably but without a financial cushion to protect against adverse shocks to health or other major risks. This is a nice, modern way of saying that 80% of the population will be poor. My anecdotal evidence, which is substantial since I live about a half mile from some Section 8 housing, is that poor people consume a lot. Most of them drive nicer cars than me, have more channels on their TVs than I do, wear more expensive clothing, electronics, jewelry than I do, and enjoy a considerably larger amount of leisure time than I do. A recurring topic of discussion around these parts of the interwebs is the idea that society is getting so advanced that lots of people have, one, no need to actually work to maintain a high standard of living, and two, don't have the intellectual ability to do anything of value in such an economy anyway. On the one hand, this vision is incredibly optimistic. We're so rich that large swaths of the population don't need to work to maintain first world living standards. On the other hand, this vision is darkly pessimistic. We really have no idea what to do with people that aren't working. Humans don't seem to be made for not working, even if they're being provided for passive voice intentional. The results from early experiments, e.g. modern Detroit, are chilling even to the most pessimistic. Back to Kling. Matt Iglesias wonders how, in a world that requires technical skill and social skills, those of us in the room, i.e. court or official intellectuals, have survived. It seems that most work for think tanks, newspapers, and other nonprofits. Tyler Cowen replies that our presence in the room is indicative of marketing skills. Each of us has proved adept at marketing with wealthy donors as our consumers in most cases. Steve Tellis points out that as society's rich accumulate wealth beyond what they can consume, their philanthropic ideas will, for better or worse, allocate society's resources. Afterward, it occurs to me that this suggests that there will emerge a toady class, meaning people whose work in one way or another flatters the wealthy. Now, I'm thinking about this 20% at the top, you know, the people who just have all these wonderful skills. What do they actually do all day? Most of them. Are they filling out TPS reports? Are they arguing for higher budgets? Oh, here's how we spent the budget for this year, but we need more next year. Are they having useless meetings that go on and on and on? Do they only exist to tick some HR boxes? I mean, the amount of waste in Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 companies is simply astounding. When I was reading about James Damore and his troubles at Google and what happened to him, you know, one learns about Google hiring all of these people simply because of intersectionality. And it would seem that very few of these people do any work at all, that they seem to regard it as their job to harangue other people in the office, either in person or via email or direct message, or their bosses themselves for not being woke enough. I do not see this as a sustainable economic model. My hypothesis is that so much of the madness of modern life that we've come to accept, this was paid for by the surplus created by capitalism, that there was so much money left over that we could afford to accommodate clowns. Well, in 2008, we learned that the money had run out, that we were going to be living on borrowed money. It's exclusively on borrowed money and ever more of it. And our financial system learned nothing from the near catastrophe of 2008 and became ever more abstract and divorced from real economic concerns. But, you know, as Jim Morrison said in a somewhat different context, they have the guns, but we have the numbers. By what means can 20% of the population, particularly a 20% which is not let's say, very manly, hold control in perpetuity over the great mass of 80%. Now, I don't know that what we saw on the Greek island of Lesbos is coming to Britain or Canada or the United States, the day after tomorrow, but I wouldn't bet against it. Globalism was sold to the masses on the basis that it would make everyone's lives better. When you complain that it doesn't, at least in, say, person A says this, person B, person C, the parents complain that their, children are going to have to live significantly less fulfilling lives than they have. Well, the comeback is that, no, it is better for everyone, but we're talking about better in the aggregate, to which the obvious response is, I don't live in an aggregate. I live in a country. I live in a city. I live in a neighborhood. But globalism presupposes that ideas like nations, countries, communities, neighborhoods, that they don't exist, or they are no longer particularly relevant. And that's an enormous gamble. And it's a gamble that I wouldn't take. Coronavirus is showing just how weak the globalist system is. And as I said a few days ago, it may lead to a radical change in general attitudes. For decades, we've been browbeaten the idea that xenophobia is terrible, that foreigners are wonderful. The more foreigners, the better. The more atomized people become, the better. Well, when faced with a literally life and death situation, which came about through globalism, people might decide to hell with it. I'm going to talk about our movie today. It's from 1987. It is directed by and co-written by Maurice Piellat. It's called Sous le soleil de Satan, Under the Sun of Satan. And it is based on the first novel by a French writer called Georges Bernanos. Bernanos lived from 1888 to 1948. Under the Sun of Satan was released in 1926. He was a soldier who was wounded in the First World War several times. He was a right-winger, a right-wing Catholic who rejected fascism, and so an increasingly polarized France in the 1930s. He found that he didn't really have a home. He left Europe for Brazil in 1938 and returned only in 1945. He had found, I suppose, a personal hero in Charles de Gaulle. But of course, de Gaulle was quickly sidelined after the end of the Second World War. There have been a number of productions based on Bernanos' book. I suppose the most famous is Robert Bresson's film, The Diary of a Country Priest. And then another film by Bresson from 1967 called Mouchette. The main female character in Under the Sun of Satan is called Mouchette. It is not the same character in the novel and film of the same name. It's a little difficult to translate. It means little fly or little fly girl, mouche being French for fly. In the movie Mouchette, this cannot be seen as a term of endearment. It seems to be rather a term of endearment in Under the Sun of Satan, although it seems strange to me. Bernanos was also responsible for the libretto for my favorite opera by Francis Poulenc called Dialogue des Carmelites, or Dialogue of the Carmelites. What can you say about Robert Bresson? That he was uncompromising. He was an exceedingly serious man, and this is an exceedingly serious film. It's a film that takes God and the devil as well as givens. Really, this movie won the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival in 1987. After it was shown, the audience seemed to hate it. There was pandemonium in the theater with people booing and whistling. And Maurice Pialat, who was, I suppose you could say, a truculent man, he shook his fists. He shook his fist and said, "If you don't like me, then I don't like you." He seemed to revel in the disapproval, and I really think that there's something to that. If you have a film which everyone says, "Oh yeah, that's great," it's typically not great. I think a great film tends to give rise to very strong feelings on both sides of the aisle. Maurice Pialat, he lived from 1925 to 2003. He does not have the cult that other French directors have, but I think that may be changing, especially since it's only in recent years that his films were available in decent DVD versions, and now they have all been released on Blu-ray versions by Gaumont. And the presentation, the visual presentation of Under the Son of Satan is outstanding. On the other hand, the Masters of Cinema 2 DVD set has a great number of really useful experts. Pialat is best known film, probably Van Gogh, is the painter. Although A Nos Amours is, well, it's a really intense and uncompromising movie as well. It's starring Sandrine Bonnard, who plays Mouchette in Under the Son of Satan. She's a revelation. This movie doesn't feature a lot of quick cutting. There are a lot of long takes, and there are a lot of long takes where we see Sandrine Bonnard's face. We see her thinking about something. We see her going through emotional turmoil, and it's very powerful indeed. The male lead, the priest, Father Donatien, is played by Gérard Depardieu, who we talked about in Theater Thursday earlier in the two films based on novels by Pagnol. You know, Gérard Depardieu is, well, he's a very physical actor. He's a very large man. He's a very powerful looking man, but he's very restrained in this film. And he is particularly good at playing gentle characters, or characters who would like to be gentle, thoughtful characters. But one always feels the power that could be harnessed at any time. The cinematography is by Willy Courant, and I think the world of it. The entire movie is filmed, well, almost entirely in available light, which gives a very muted, gentle palette to the film. There are scenes in it, long scenes, which I would assume that use filters to make a twilight effect, a nightmarish kind of effect, because this is a horror movie. It's a religious movie, but it is a horror movie. There is very little music in this film, and I generally tend to think that's superior to a film which is bursting with music. And it was not written for the film. It was written, it was taken off the shelf, as it were, by the French symphonist Henri Dutilleux. and it is quite good. The film is set in the Calais region of France, in northern France, in the 1920s, and it's about a priest. And he is, I should explain something about Catholic vocation. You are chosen to be a priest, you do not choose to be a priest. That is the philosophy. That there were strict intellectual requirements to becoming a priest before the Second Vatican Council, when they were all thrown out the window, and surprise, surprise, you started getting a bunch of grossly inferior men being ordained priests. For instance, one had to be fluent in Latin to become a priest, to become even a parish priest. And we learn that Gérard Depardieu's character, Father Donnezson, he was not exactly what you'd call an outstanding student. But he was mentored by a man who became the dean of his parish, Father Menu Segre, who is played by the director Maurice Pialat. And he seems a very gentle man, very understanding and wise, although he says that wisdom is the vice of the old. He's self-aware enough to know that one gets old and one can toss off platitudes and people nod their head, and he must know what he's talking about. He must have it all figured out. But the dean knows that that is not true. If you were looking for strict narrative continuity or exactitude in this film, well, you're not going to get it, although the emotional exactitude is certainly there. That Father Donnezson seems to have come to a kind of crossroads where the duties of being a parish priest have exhausted him, and they have exhausted him emotionally and spiritually. That he invests a great deal of himself. And this is, you see the commitment shown in the very first film of the scene, where the older priest is giving the younger one what's called the tonsure. It is a shaved bald spot on the top of the head to indicate submission. Of course, all the priests are wearing their floor-length cassocks, or soutanes, as they call them in France. And these are, no question, these are hommes sérieux. These are serious men. These days, you can't even recognize most Catholic priests who go out of the way to let you know that they're just regular guys, but they're not supposed to be regular guys. The soutanes are black. Black is the color, as Kunat-Ledin pointed out, of priests and anarchists. That one wears a uniform as distinct as the cassock. It is not possible to be invisible. Everyone knows who you are. Everyone knows what you do. You are a living symbol of the church. And of course, you are administering the sacraments and taking confessions. The book came out about a generation after what was a kind of mini revolution in France in 1905, when the all church property was nationalized, Catholic schooling was banned, etc., etc. The Freemasons, yes, really, had taken over control of the French government. And they were keen to let everyone know that while France may have been Catholic at one point, it was no longer so. And you see the first generation of children who had been raised under this new regime, teenage girls that we see, they're all wearing their mantillas. The rule was at the time and up to the Second Vatican Council that women in churches had to cover their heads. And you see them coming out of the church after Mass, and they're all smirking. And the suggestion is, they're talking about boys or whatever. And the older priest says, they want communion without confession. The young priest is haunted by the idea that France has been taken over by a kind of cancer, that no one wants to talk about God and the devil anymore because it's too difficult. People want pleasant lives, and they want their freedom. They want to be able to do whatever they want and not have to suffer any consequences for it. And this idea torments Donnisson. He is not by any means what one might call a normal character. He is a saint, and like many saints, he appears to normal people as being unbalanced. And there's no attempt to hide this in Piala's film. Piala was an atheist. This is a religious film, obviously, but it is not the kind of religious film which is meant to have people, applauding and cheering when they leave. It is far more naturalistic and bleaker even than, say, Carl Dreyer's Ordet, which also, like this film, features a spectacular eruption of the numinous into everyday life. The young priest, he wants to retire from the world. He wants to be reassigned to a Trappist monastery. Trappist monasteries, no speech is allowed. And the older priest says, this is a poor parish. We can't afford any useless mouths. He confesses to the younger priest that he thought that he could mold him, but instead the younger priest was molding him instead, and he wants that to continue. He believes, the older priest, that the younger priest has a very valuable role to play in the parish. He gives him a task to travel some miles, just 8 miles over rough country, to another village, to fill in for a priest, a retiring priest, and to hear confessions. And, well, he doesn't get there. And we see him duplicating Christ in the desert, Christ tempted by the devil. And at the end of this, he has a vision, and he meets a young woman. And that woman, Mouchette or Germaine, she is 16 years old, and she is quite the coquette, or petite salope, as one of her lovers snarls at her, little bitch or little slut. She has discovered the tremendous power of her sexuality, and seeking to rebel against her parents, she has got herself involved with several men, including a marquis, no less, Cadignan, and a deputy, a politician, and a doctor, Gallet. And she is pregnant. Which man has impregnated her? She's not sure. We're never sure. It's not particularly important. She uses this pregnancy to blackmail the older men, that they will, give her. One of them is married and has 2 children. The scientist, the deputy. The other fellow, he talks about, selling a mill that he owns to put together funds. And what does Mouchette want? She wants 1,000 different things, and then she doesn't want them. And, well, she spans the gamut of emotions in the space of a few minutes. And I mean, she has been reduced to such a state, a sexual plaything. As one of her two lovers says, there are difficulties involved in sleeping with minors. Yes, serious difficulties. And we see that her life, this cancer that I mentioned, that she stinks of death, and that this talk of, fornication and abortion and suicide and murder. And these two men are not really in any position to do anything for her, because she is an impossible person. Now, of course, they never should have got involved with her in the first place, but she takes a very sinful pride in her beauty, in her sexuality, in her ability to turn men's heads, and she is really committed to this up to the point of her own destruction. She finds a shotgun on the table of the Marquis and starts playing around with it, and he says, "What's that you've got?" And then off screen, she shoots him to death, and then covers up the evidence of the crime. There's an inquest, and it is decided that it is a suicide because the gunshot was at such close range. She confesses this to the deputy, and he refuses to believe her. Now, she has a difficulty in describing herself and her emotions, that she, like the younger priest, seems to be half mad, and people don't believe her. They think they're making things up for effect. So our younger priest takes this journey through rural France, and he finds himself quickly exhausted, that the night has come, it's difficult to see, and a good Samaritan appears, Jean-Christophe Beauvais, playing a horse dealer. And it turns out this fellow is, well, the devil himself. He poses as a good Samaritan, but then it turns out he knows all about the priests and his doubts. And he says that I have marked you, that you will surrender to me. You will understand that all this talk is nonsense, that God is the enemy, and that I am the truth. He's a little man, unshaven, with rough clothing, not the sort of, typically in movies, the devil in a physical manifestation is a terrifying physical presence, or alternately he's, exceedingly thin, and seems to be, a kind of a genius in some way. Now, this is a very ordinary devil. And so the young priest comes to a kind of realization that he's going to devote the rest of his life to this struggle between God and the devil. And he has a vision. He has a vision of Mouchette, and he knows suddenly all about her. And he confronts her where she lives, and she's, she's making the walk of shame from one of her lover's homes. And he tells her everything about herself. And he says that you've told me all about this. And she said very little. And he tries to impress upon her that God has not forsaken you, that your crimes are, relatively trivial, that everything that you have done has been done before, that you are suffering under the illusion that you are some sort of rebel, that your life is, somehow different, that you come from a family of generations of people doing the same thing. And she is understandably rather bemused by this. She returns to her family home. She thrashes about on the bed. She checking to see whether her father is at home. She goes into the bathroom and gets her straight razor and slits her throat. The priest realizes what has happened. He kicks down the door, and he grabs her body, which is ebbing of life, and he drags it to the church and lays it before the altar. Now, one of the virtues of having Gerard Depardieu as your leading man is that there is a lot of physicality in this role, and no one would think twice about, a priest such as him taking, a woman weighing 100, 110 pounds, and carrying her for, many blocks. It just seems like something that he could easily do. The bishop is dragged into this, and he comments disapprovingly that laying this out in front of the altar, this is very old school. We don't do that kind of thing anymore. Maurice Pialat's priest is, again, totally bemused. Like, you've gone mad. This behavior that you have indulged in. What is the meaning? What is the meaning of this? And there's a terrifying scene when the poor girl's parents come to the church, and the mother throws herself on the body and is covered with blood, and then later the father comes. Gerard Depardieu is also covered with blood as well, and later the father comes, and there's a tussle with the priest, and all these onlookers have come on. Then there is he is returned to the Trappist monastery or some sort of retreat. Again, there is a passage of time here, and it's not made exactly clear, but there is a medical emergency. He is called to the home of a sick boy, and we discover that the priest has become famous locally, that he's become a figure of great reverence, that a cultus has formed around him. And so he visits the sick boy's home, but it's too late. The poor boy has already died of meningitis. And then Father Donisson has another decision to make. I won't spoil what happens, but the result of this is that an even greater legend attaches itself to him. But he remains as tormented as he was previously. His mentor had told him something like, if only 1 in 30 of those that we give absolution to, reform, then, we will win the world. But Donisson is not at all convinced of that, and he is tormented with the rather selfish thought, which he understands to be selfish, that he believes that he as one man can save the world, whereas Christians believe it was Jesus Christ who saved the world. But he is determined to wear himself out, to exhaust himself, to save as many souls as he can. The movie ends rather ambiguously, but it's completely in the style of the rest of the movie, which is, realistic, despite its supernatural elements, and there is never any straining for effect, none. I watched this movie again this morning, and I found the effect to be just absolutely overwhelming. I mentioned Robert Bresson. Bresson famously did not use actors in his later films, but I think that Pialat here, he rather achieves the same effect as Bresson. I can understand why the audience at the screening in Cannes thought this film was risible, that they booed and hissed, because we live in a world that simply doesn't take God and the devil seriously any longer. So this film, would have seemed ridiculous to them, but it certainly didn't seem ridiculous to me. I think that it is one of the greatest films ever made about religious faith. And especially given what I was saying earlier about the extraordinary transfer, which you can now get on Blu-ray. This movie has my highest reservations. I will add a warning, though, that a lot of viewers might find it to be, as I say, overwhelming, because it is like all of the creations which derive from Georges Bernanos' work. It is uncompromising. There's no sugarcoating going on. So that wraps it up for the KMG show today. It is the beginning of Lent this week, and so we have a religious theme. We had PLS film today. Tomorrow, we will have a novel by a woman who was not an atheist. She was a Roman Catholic, but she was writing about Protestants. And not in a mocking way, not in a grotesque way, just attempting to show the reality of the South, as she spent pretty much her entire life in the South, state of Georgia. Flannery O'Connor, and the book is called Wise Blood. So thank you all for watching, for listening. If people would like to donate to the show, my PayPal account is associated with the email kevin_grace@hotmail.com. Good night, and hopefully we'll see you all tomorrow. If you like the show, I would urge you all to subscribe.